Hello, everybody. Welcome to our program today, hosted by the Getty Villa Museum in Los Angeles. My name is Shelby Brown, and I'm a senior education specialist at the Villa. This is the home of the Getty Museum's ancient Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art. And I'd like to acknowledge that the Getty Villa lies on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, and we are joining you with honor and respect for the deep history of this region. Today's speaker with me here is Amy Gansell. She's Associate Professor of Art History at St. John's University, where she is also the Director of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She's a specialist in ancient Near Eastern art, and she has focused a great deal of research on Assyrian queens in particular, and on conceptions of female beauty in the ancient Near East. Our talk today focuses on the beauty and power of Assyrian queens, which complements the exhibition Assyria, Palace Art of Ancient Iraq, which is on view at the Villa through September 5, 2022. Please enjoy the talk. I'll hand you over now to Amy.
Thank you, Shelby. I'd like to begin with my land's acknowledgement by recognizing that truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We at St. John's University in New York City acknowledge that we occupy the ancestral lands of the Matinecock, Rockaway, Lenape, and Canarsie peoples. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. And now, with World Heritage in mind, let us turn to the land of Mesopotamia. It is my honor to share with you today a presentation on the beauty and power of Assyrian queens. This presentation provides a preview of some of the content from my book in progress to be published by Oxford University Press. If anyone is interested in that future publication, I welcome you to check out my Twitter and my website for updates. The links are on this slide. Before I begin, however, I'd like to take a moment to thank you all for your interest and for joining me today. I'd also like to thank the Getty very much for inviting me to give this presentation and for providing all the necessary technical support to make a virtual event possible. So now let's jump into ancient Mesopotamia, to the place and period of the Assyrian Empire. To get you oriented, this map shows the Near East, or Western Asia. Our view is centered on the Tigris and Euphrates River. The land between those rivers, that is Mesopotamia. The northern region of Mesopotamia is Assyria, as you see marked on the map. Some of the ancient cities that we'll be talking about are Nineveh and Nimrud. They're located near the modern city of Mosul. And just to give you a few other coordinates here, Baghdad is located in what is the equivalent of central Mesopotamia, and it's relatively close to the ancient city of Babylon. The Assyrian Empire was situated with its core in this region of northern Mesopotamia, but it controlled a vast, vast territory beyond this core. And the time period that we'll be talking about is the Neo-Assyrian Empire from about 900 to 600 BCE. So Assyrian palace art is primarily known through its relief sculptures, these sculptures of images of the king, his male companions, the court, and masculinity, typically showing scenes of battle, such as you see here, as well as hunt. And this hunt that you see is almost a kind of gladiatorial combat, where you have at the top of the scene lions jumping out of a cage, coming face to face with the king, who is of course going to prevail and kill them. In the bottom of the scene, you see the king pouring a libation over the slain lions. So ritual, along with hunt and war, are very prominent in the imagery of Assyrian palace art. And because this, like with many people, was my first exposure to Assyrian art, I'm going to tell you a brief story. When I was thinking about what topic to do my dissertation on, I knew I wanted to do something on women. And I wasn't exactly sure where to focus. So I went in to see my dissertation advisor and I said, well, the one thing I do know is that I'm not working on the Assyrian period because we just don't have enough evidence for women. And she totally turned me around and pointed out that we don't think we have enough evidence because nobody has done the work to pool it together and to fill in this crucial portion of history, the power of the women of the Assyrian court. So I began that process with my dissertation, and I have found so much evidence. I have just continued to work and discover more and to get even more excited about what it is that we're finding and how we can build on it. So that's what I'm bringing to you today. So this is the one palace relief. It is from the site of Nineveh that does show the queen. She is shown here in an upright chair, sitting here as the king reclines. It is rare that that chair is even referred to as her throne, but indeed we see the queen enthroned. She and the king are lifting drinking bowls up, presumably filled with wine in celebration of a victory banquet. They're seated under a grape arbor. This is a scene of peace. The king's weapons are laid to the side at the table. Music is playing, but if you look in the tree behind the queen is the head of the enemy hanging there. So violence is not far from this scene. It's a reminder, though, that the queen is not just here having dinner with the king, but this is a state event. It is a celebration of an imperial victory. It's also very likely a ritual scene because any kind of victory is owed to the great gods and goddesses of Assyria. And further evidence that it is a ritual victory is that we see these kind of mushroom-shaped containers on either side of the banquet. Those are incense burners, and we also see them in ritual scenes. So we have the queen at the center of the state, at the center of ritual, working in collaboration with the king. So the queen that we just saw is Labali-sharrat. That's the queen of King Ashurbanipal. On that banquet scene, there's not an inscription that's naming the queen. However, we do know that Labali-sharrat was queen of Ashurbanipal because of this stele. It is broken. It is, however, inscribed, and it preserves very important information. So it does say this is the image of the queen. It shows her on a throne, this little nub behind her back. That's the top of her throne with a ritual sash thrown over the back. She's wearing a crown. She has earrings on, a bracelet, and we cannot see what's broken off in her hands, but it was probably ritual and or ceremonial materials that would be reserved for somebody of the highest rank in the court. Yes, indeed, there are other images of queens. This is a bronze fragment. It's in the Louvre today. It shows a queen Nakia. We know her name again because it is inscribed. The majority of that cuneiform inscription that you see going across to the figures is describing a ritual in which the queen, that is the shorter figure, is engaged in with the king whom she follows. We also know they're shown here in ritual because they're both holding what look like sticks up to their nose. We don't know exactly what that piece of equipment is, but it occurs in other ritual scenes. The king and queen differ, however, in their ritual participation in what they carry in their opposite hands. The king has a mace, a ceremonial weapon, and the queen is raising a mirror. Mirrors are associated with beauty and appearance and also with goddesses. She, like the king, is wearing the crown of state. And once we start moving away from the larger scale images, we find that there are further images of queens, all of which are very informative. And I'm just showing you one example here of a seal. It's a Chalcedony seal. It's a very beautiful white carved stone. It's difficult to see the image when we are looking at the stone itself. So we're going to focus our eyes to the right on the modern impression, but you can see how carefully carved that image is because it's carrying very important information. It shows the king and queen approaching an enthroned goddess in ritual, in supplication. They both have their hands raised in a ritual action. That means the queen is not a bystander here. She's not watching the king as he participates. She's not just standing behind him. She, like Nakia, as we just saw, is an active participant. And she's pictured because it is necessary for us to know that she was there at that ritual. That ritual would not accomplish what it was meant to accomplish were the queen not present. So here we see the significance of her role. You may also be wondering why there's a scorpion floating around at the top of this scene. So in these small carved seals, wherever there was space, if they needed to relay some extra information, they would squeeze it in there. So the location of it up there does not mean it's a constellation, just that's where they could put it. But what the scorpion means is very important. It's the emblem of the Queen of Assyria. To have that scorpion on this seal means this is not just a picture of the king and queen. This is a seal representing the office of queenship, either one that was stamped by the queen herself or by her representative, representing the authority of the Queen of Assyria. So here we have another example, not just of her power in ritual, but her power administratively. I bring you now to another seal. This is almost a breathtaking seal, not only in the fact that it is solid gold, carved with that scorpion again. Around the edge of the seal, you see the cuneiform writing. It identifies the queen as Queen Hama, the queen of Shalmaneser. So this is an earlier queen from the 700s. On the seal, the scorpion is fit in behind the enthroned goddess. Approaching the goddess, the female figure, that is the queen. It's probably Queen Hama herself, if not the personal image of Queen Hama. It is a representation of the office of queenship, which Hama fulfilled in taking on her reign and carrying the seal. Where did this seal come from? Her body. It was found, excavated from her burial, found with her bones, found with her body, is part of her identity, and it was part of her dress. You can see it's a bit out of focus back here when we'll see this seal again, but it has a loop on the end. It's for attachment. It would have been strung on a chain and attached to her garment with a fibula. So this is part of Queen Hama. What else did Hama have? Well, of course, as queen, she had her headdress. And you might already be noticing, if you're looking at details, that different queens in different time periods from different cities have different crowns. That is a topic that would be an entire other presentation, but I can get more into it in the Q&A if you're interested. In any case, these headdresses, these gold headdresses were outstanding in that the person wearing them would stand out. Only the king and queen wore any kind of significant headdress like this, except for the gods and goddesses. So it's aligning them in their appearance with the divine, as well as marking their rank in the court. So I just want to take a moment to have a bit of a closer look also at this headdress. It's made of gold. The very top of it is a smattering of grape leaves, like a grapevine. Then going around that open work area, you have these winged, fantastical, maybe divine figures, and along that bottom row, that dense network of fruiting plants and flowers. So maybe we have pomegranates, some blossoms, and we're going to look at it up close. Also, just want to give you a moment to see the craftsmanship that goes into the production of this royal jewelry. We have granulation, the use of molten drops of gold applied to the objects here. The grapes that are carved, that are dangling down off the top of it, what a jingle jangled in front of her forehead, they are carved out of lapis lazuli, a material imported from Afghanistan, so precious material. And all together, this not only announced, I am queen, but this probably also expressed her beauty through some attributes, such as purity. Purity is associated with the divine, those winged figures that you see and that are protecting her. with fertility, the fruiting of the plants, and with sexuality, the kind of reproductive nature, the regeneration of the vine itself. So I mentioned that these materials from Queen Hama came from her tomb. And this is where we just start pulling more and more evidence to understand the beauty and power of these Assyrian queens. At the Northwest Palace at the site of Nimrud, in the residential sector of the palace, that's the part that you see here in the darker black, several tombs were found. Those are the boxes marked in red that were beneath the palace floors. And in those tombs were several queens, women who were named in inscription, who were referred to as queen. The title for queen in Akkadian, the Assyrian language, is woman of the palace. So you see, they are women of the palace in life and in death and forever after. They also have texts that refer to the thrones upon which these women sit and sit for eternity. So the queens are part of the palace. Very lucky for us researchers, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, an Iraqi team began to excavate these tombs, and what they found were intact and semi-intact coffins and sarcophagi, as you see here, that they were able to plot out the position of artifacts in relation to the bones. And in the reconstruction that you see, the plan with the jewelry laid out on the skeleton on the far right, that's a project that I did a few years ago, just starting to illustrate what those artifacts are. And lo and behold, it is the regalia of the queen placed along the body where it had been worn. There were some cases in which finger bones were found with rings still attached to them. So we were able to see the manner in which these women were buried. Here's a great example too. This silver item is a mirror. It's a silver mirror. It was found right next to the hand of this deceased royal woman. Let's have a look at some of the materials from these tombs. They are stunning, they're breathtaking, but I want you to even move past our appreciation of them as treasures and imagine them as part of these queens, part of their regalia. You see the dishes, the drinking bowls, like we saw on the banquet scene, that was part of their royal equipment, their royal identity, this mirror in this box here. And they're stored here in boxes. I want to give you a sense of how packed these sarcophagi were with the contents of their state ornaments, regalia, and jewelry. Here, of course, on the right, you see one of the headdresses being pulled out of storage. So I'm going to give you a bit of a tour from head to foot of what these queens were wearing. So we have a variety of headdresses here. Earrings. Earrings were found in some of the coffins in scores, in heaps and piles. And in some of these pictures, you can see very clearly the different stones and materials that are being used: agate, turquoise, carnelian. Carnelian is imported, that's the orange stone from the Indus Valley. Here we have two examples of necklaces as we move down the body. In the example on the left, these are both made of agate, but the agate is cut in the shape of eye stones, which many pieces of evidence suggest were intended to reflect or deflect malevolence from the body. So this is protective and beautifying. And descriptions of goddesses also describe them as wearing this kind of jewelry from head to foot and referring to some of the stones, including the ones included in the queen's regalia as what the goddesses themselves wore. Here are some examples of not only the agate, but also blue stones. We had turquoise, we had lapis lazuli, which I mentioned before, and also faience, a kind of early glass that produces a blue hue. And then, of course, on the far right, we have our reddish orange, the carnelian from the Indus Valley. So they're wearing empire, and they're wearing empire beyond. They're showing the reaches of the power of the empire on the body of the queen. Some of the gold necklaces are so heavy that they require counterweights, like you see on this bottom right example, to take the weight of the necklace itself off the back of the woman's neck. Rings were worn, everything was worn symmetrically. So 10 rings on every finger and both thumbs in a matching set, in slightly different sizes. So these were made specifically to fit the individual who would be wearing them. And of course, bracelets coming in pairs. You can get an idea from the bottom right example also of the heft of these bracelets and the size of them. And anklets also worn in pairs. Again, you have an example here of the woman holding one of these anklets out of the heft of the size. The anklets weighed between about 1 and 1.7 pounds a piece. It's not enough to immobilize a person, but it's certainly a lot of weight, a reminder of empire, to be worn probably in pride, perhaps to be flashed beneath the tassels of the garment as the queen walked. Yes, the garment, you might be wondering, what are these queens wearing? So no intact garments were found, but pieces, tufts of linen were found. So presumably they're wearing linen garments. Tests have suggested there was some embroidery possibly on them, and that the fabric might have been bleached and or burnished to make it radiant and shiny. So a bright white gown, maybe think of a modern bride's white wedding gown or something. But on top of that, ornamenting it, we have these gold foil discs. These are thin and relatively small, maybe something like a large sequin. Some of them have loops on the back for attachment or holes like you would sew a button on. So they would have ornamented the garment and created this radiance that covered the body that might be akin to a term called malamu, which is a divine radiance. Gods and goddesses are described as having this. The king is described as having this. And here I think we are able to put the clothing together, the jewelry together, and imagine, as here we see Labali-sharrat carved in stone, a loss of any paint or color to enliven this image. We can start to imagine what she would have looked like, covered in gold, dressed in empire. And this dressing in empire is a sign of power, but the dressing is also, I believe, a construction of beauty. That radiance is an aspect of beauty. The purity that I pointed out in the crown with the divine figures. The radiance is also a sign of purity itself. It's untouchable. In addition to that, we think, well, maybe what you're finding in the tombs is just what they're buried in. They didn't actually represent all this on their bodies in life. Well, looking at the art, it does seem like that already, but to further strengthen that argument, we can match some of the earrings, like you see on the top right, to the earrings that are carved here on Labali Sharat's image. The garment that she is shown has the little circles carved in it. Those are probably simplified references to these foil gold ornaments that would have covered the royal robes. So what else is the queen wearing, and what else does it tell us about her beauty and power? So here you see again the seal of Hama, which I explained was actually attached to, would have been attached to the garment, attached to her body, an extension of her identity. In addition to that, we have several other seals, including some cylinder seals. We're going to take a closer look at a couple of these now. The top left object, this seal, it's carved in the shape of a cow. A cow was actually an emblem of fertility in ancient Mesopotamia, and the cow is associated with a goddess who was known for her beauty and her sexuality. So we have the image of the cow begetting, when it is stamped, a nude winged goddess figure. So while the queen's sexuality and fertility were not necessarily on display in the dress that she was wearing in an explicit way, it was reiterated, not just through the symbolism of the fruits and flowers she's adorned in, but through very quite literal images of a nude curvaceous goddess being stamped out of the emblem of a cow. And this again is a seal associated with the body of one of those queens. We even have next to it a really simple looking seal that again has a very similar image. Now, once we start looking also beyond the flashy gold objects, we continue to get a lot of information and clues about the beauty and power of these queens. On the bottom, you see a necklace of these kind of light blue looking Flies, yes, those are flies. Those are faience beads of flies. Flies are associated with death and the decay of the body, of course, but also with fertility and with the regeneration of life. So it may have had a funerary connotation, but in addition to that, it has this reference to life and fertility, which seems to be an aspect of the beauty of the queen. If we think of beauty as an idealization of her femininity and her feminine powers, power is political, but power is also has these natural sources that are embodied in the queen. And you might be wondering, what is that grainy image that she's showing us to the right? Well, that is the only image of this object that exists. There are 3 such objects that were found in one of the tombs. These are erotic plaques showing images of intercourse. These are not pornographic. These were probably ritual, sacred, very powerful imagery that was buried with the queen. So again, this isn't something worn on her body, but it was associated with her body in death as a reminder of perhaps her contribution in extending the lineage of the dynasty and her fertility and sexuality. A couple other objects just to take a peek at. This is one of those drinking bowls, and on it is carved Egyptian imagery. The bowl itself is probably of Levantine culture, so it's Egyptian style imagery. How it would have been understood within Assyria is unknown, but a bit of a twist is that some queens, including Queen Hama, are probably from royal families from the Levant, from the West, that married into the Assyrian court and became Assyrian queens. This Western region I refer to was also considered to be very fertile. And of course, the imagery here of Egypt that is shown is an image of a marsh, of a very fertile land. So it's both a political reference to the power of the empire, and it is a reference to the fertility that is associated with these queens. Similarly, we have this stamp seal in an Assyrian mount carved out of carnelian, which is an import from the East, and on it is carved what is probably a pseudo-hieroglyphic script. So a non-linguistic inscription that is meant to look like hieroglyphs, that is meant to be a reference to the exotic, to the realm beyond the Assyrian Empire, but that which is still controlled and represented perhaps through the bodies of these queens and the markings they made with their authority as they would stamp documents and objects. So this is a simulation that I created a couple years ago with a company called Learning Sites. Learning Sites does 3D virtual reality simulations of various ancient sites, including one of the Northwest Palace. And when I was looking at their simulation and researching queens, I thought, you know, all of the figures that are in the simulation are male. Well, of course they are, because that's what most of the published evidence tells us. How would we know what a queen looks like? But I think we can piece together, putting the material from the tombs together with the art, with text, and develop an image of an Assyrian queen, a 3D avatar, perhaps, that can walk through that palace as well. So this is the result. It's a simulation. It's an estimate of what a queen would look like holding her seal there, wearing jewelry from those tombs. So the queen has entered the palace at this point. Recently, there's a video which is available on YouTube at the 1 minute, 49 minute mark. You see the queen, you see her here on the far right. She enters into this room. It's the king's banquet though. There's not a role for her that is defined in the narrative of this video. She does not engage and take a seat of power. However, again, that's because of our limitations of knowledge. It's because I haven't published our next results yet, but we're getting to that point, I hope. In the simulation of the Northwest Palace that Learning Sites did, which is incredible, they have as you see here, made a simulation of the king's throne room. The king is shown exiting the room, followed by a eunuch courtier. A male associate stands there by the throne upon a dais, in front of which is a brazier. If you look carefully, you see it's on tracks. So there were movable tracks in the palace, archaeologically attested, in which these braziers could be moved closer or farther from the enthroned dignitary. Now, let's go back to that residential area of the Northwest Palace, the area where those queens' tombs, those women of the palace, were buried forever, for eternity. In their life, there's a suite of rooms that, and the research I've conducted has corroborated suggestions that other scholars have also made, that this circled suite of rooms would have been the queen's suite, and not just her bedroom, not just her female chamber, but her throne room, her place of power in the palace. And when you see that kind of rectangular drawing in the center of room 42AF, what that is the archaeological marking for the tracks where one of those braziers would have been. So moving back and forth, suggesting that the queen would have, be this her suite, sat upon her throne. Here is an example of a throne from this period at Nimrud. I know it doesn't have the high back like we saw in Labali Sharat, but this is the type of throne the king would have sat on in this period. So install one of those thrones in this room, put together our queen with her throne in the throne room with her stamp, and acting her role as woman of the palace in the office of queenship. And one day, I hope we will see the queen in her beauty and power back in her throne room. Thank you so much. Thank you for your attention. And I look forward to talking to you about so many of these points and answering your questions.
Thank you, Amy. That is so interesting. I have to say, the most interesting piece of jewelry to me is the fly necklace. And I can't help wondering if Assyrian queens, as you make them more known to the public, will inspire a new jewelry theme that we have not thought of so far, because that's really something. We have a lot of interesting questions, and I think I'll hop between big themes and small ones. So one of the bigger ones is, could you provide a little more context for the queen's household and how it evolved and changed over time, in addition to her accoutrements?
Okay, so first of all, we might start with the background of how does one become a queen. So you could become a queen through marriage. As a late teenager, you marry either a crown prince who becomes king, or you are married to the man who is already king, probably coming in as a second or later wife. The kings had many wives, but only one of those women filled the office of queenship and had that title, woman of the palace. There are also some cases in which the mother of the king fills the role of queen. So within that context, the queen we need to think of as a royal official, the second ranked royal official in the palace. She has her own administration. She has her own household that is based probably in that suite at the Northwest Palace that I showed you. She has scribes, so we know that she's transacting written documents and contracts. There's evidence that the queens owned real estate, they owned property, they owned land. There's evidence that queens were also involved in military maneuvers, and one later queen had her own military guard that she could decide strategically, oh, we're going to send them out. There is an earlier queen who is probably becomes known as Semiramis, if either anybody has heard of her, who went out on campaign with the king. So these women are moving around, they're engaged at kind of all levels of state administration. Who they are living with and how their private life was set up is the part that we know the least about, because that is what's not really documented in text. That room that I showed you that I said was likely her throne room has a room behind it that we tend to call the retiring quarters with a bathroom, and say, oh, well, she went to bed back there and that was her private bathroom. That's where she changed her clothes. The king's suite is right across the courtyard from where that queen's suite is. So he had his main ceremonial throne room in a separate area. He would have had a kind of private throne room in his own suite, and then maybe his bedroom and bathroom, but they're a courtyard apart. So if they lived together in one of those suites or not, we don't know. But I will mention the king's bathroom has 2 bathtubs in it. So they may have been spending time together there. What about her children, right? The queen is supposed to reproduce. This fertility and sexuality is part of her identity. So we do not have evidence for children living in the palace. We do not have archaeological or architectural evidence to suggest where they might even have lived. So it is likely in elite society, and looking back at some earlier Mesopotamian queens, our evidence is spotty, so like 1,000 years before, they're sent off with wet nurses. They are raised outside of the palace. They're educated outside of the palace. They're kept in contact with the king and queen, but they're not actively kind of overseeing a nursery of children in the palace itself. So I hope that answers a little bit more about how the household functions.
That's great. That really illuminates possibilities. And of course, we don't know enough. We never do. So that's the glory of archaeology. There's a question about the gold, and you answered it partly because you showed both foil and more solid objects, but could you talk about the quality of the gold that's being used for their jewelry and the construction of the heavier objects?
So some of the heaviest objects are cast objects, and the lighter objects, the foils, are hammered out objects. We're using granulation, we're using wire twisting techniques, and kind of melting metal to metal. We also have a lot of decoration that would have been inlaid. So we have channels in which molten color, or more often cut stones, are inlaid and kind of caged in around their edges to further decorate the objects. The gold that you see is quite heavy. The headdress that has the grapes dangling off of it, that weighs about 2 pounds. Again, it's heavier than what we usually wear, but it's not unwearable. So these aren't things that you would have to be laying in your coffin in order to wear. You would feel the heft of it, but they are very wearable. The wire is also, it's obviously everything's by hand, but it's twisted, and there are various kind of rope-like patterns that are used consistently to create the wire. And from looking at some of those details, we can try to identify them as Assyrian made, but we don't have royal jewelry at this level coming from other regions within the Near East besides Egypt to be able to really compare. This detail of craftsmanship is distinctively Mesopotamian, distinctly Assyrian, because in the Levant, they twisted the wire in this direction. So we don't have enough comparison. I call a lot of the jewelry pan-Near Eastern, because we see variations of it showing up from Iran to Turkey to Israel-Palestine area in its design. But you might have a bronze example that came from a non-elite tomb, and you're trying to compare that to an Assyrian gold example, but the designs themselves, a lot of them seem to have been spread very broadly, just like fashion is today.
We have a related question about where the gold was found, whether it was from Egypt or whether it's local. Where does the gold come from?
So the source of the gold is not certain. Some of it may be coming from Egypt. There's other sources that are in Turkey, and some of the gold may be reused from earlier times. So being able to identify its source necessarily doesn't tell us that the Assyrians were getting it directly from that source, but it could have come into Mesopotamia 1,000 years earlier from that source and represent a different relationship than the ones the Assyrians had actively, or what mines were available at that time.
We have a couple of scorpion questions. We have a villa scorpion on an amuletic ring, so that's also of interest to me. The questions are about why the scorpion came to be associated with the queen and how old that imagery is.
So the scorpions are super interesting. To specifically connect the scorpion to the queen, we just have a consistency in the image of the scorpion showing up on objects that are also inscribed with names of queens. So sometimes it's, as you see on the seal, it looks like it's part of imagery. In other cases, it's almost pictographic. You'll have a cuneiform inscription that runs maybe across a bowl, naming this bowl belongs to such and such queen. At the end of it, they don't have punctuation in Akkadian, but they would draw a little picture of a scorpion. So it's this kind of pictographic reiteration of the queen. It is possible that it's an image that was kind of encapsulating the presence of the queen wherever that scorpion was present. It could also just be a non-verbal symbol to communicate this belongs to the queen to somebody who cannot read the cuneiform inscription. So it's that consistency of association of text and image that we nail it to queen. But then once you start to look at what a scorpion is, the scorpion in nature, it's a very fierce animal. And the mother scorpion carries her young on her back and protects them. And any predator that would come up, she will strike them with her tail and protect those children that she carries on her back. So that's the reference to motherhood. There's also a goddess who is associated with the scorpion. We've had difficulty drawing a direct connection between that goddess and queens in text, but if you assume the goddess is represented in the form of the scorpion, then we do have a strong association of goddess and queen in image.
Well, that brings up the fact that there's interest in the goddesses involved, both the ones identified with the queens and wait, there was another one. Start with that one and I'll find it. But the various goddesses that this kind of queenly power seems to reflect.
Okay, so we have assumed, and all of this is changing, with the more evidence that we find, the more we think about it week to week, day to day, and year to year. It has always been assumed that those goddesses that you see, especially those enthroned on the lion, that must be Ishtar. Ishtar is a very powerful female who is associated with war. So that's traditionally kind of masculine territory, and also with feminine characteristics and fertility. She's said to suckle the king in some texts, describing almost her motherhood. But in mythology, she has usually a fierce role, and she's a protector. But if we think of that protector again, think of the scorpion. There's a close connection that we can kind of see the queen as protector of her household, protector of her offspring, of the royal offspring. Now, I'm beginning to think a lot of these goddesses that we see, it's very hard to identify who they are, and some of the winged divine spirit type figures. So they could be many goddesses. There are so many goddesses mentioned in mythology with all kinds of different attributes, all of which you can align with the identity of the queen. So it may be kind of a general reference to the female divine that we're seeing in these goddesses, not one specific goddess, or we might have multiple goddesses that are represented, and we've kind of lazily been saying, oh, they must all be Ishtar, when, even a nude winged goddess, that's a sexual aspect that is associated with the goddess Ishtar, but there are other goddesses who have sexual aspects, and many of whom have sometimes more blatant sexual aspects than Ishtar herself does. So I like to, at this point, I'm just thinking it's the feminine divine in all iterations that is associated with the queen. The queen doesn't fully embody them. She's not divine on earth, but she emulates them. She brings them, she evokes them, she worships them, and she brings them to earth, I think, through her and her deeds.
Well, I found the other one that was related, which brought in real women and how treatment of women in society compares with or balances out this more powerful aspect and divine aspect of the queen.
So the daily life of an Assyrian woman, just like the daily life of an Assyrian man, would have been very, very different from what we see happening in the royal court. They, for one thing, they wouldn't have had the luxuries and the support that the kings and queens had. The women, if they were not working as wet nurses, would be wet nursing in their homes for much of their adult life. They died quite young. So we do know that they were very occupied, that they had to work hard and labor to support their households, men and women. We do have legal text about marriage. Marriage was a contract that all levels of society except the enslaved engaged in. So you have contractual marriages where there's bride price, there's dowry. So it's an economic exchange. It's a deal between families, but you also have opportunities for divorce, in which the king, which the man can leave the wife if she has been bad, and there are many definitions of that. But let's say that she's unable to produce offspring. He can marry again, but he cannot throw her out on the street. What if she's sick? There's legal documents to, if you have a sick wife, you have to continue to take care of her in your house. You cannot throw her out. You can take another wife, but you still have to care for and support her. So there were some protections for women. There are also opportunities for women to bring grievances against their husbands if they're being neglected or abused. And in those cases, the women could go back to, they're not just free agents usually, but they could go back to the household of their father or of a brother if the father is deceased. So they would, have some protection and support. That anything that they brought property-wise into the marriage could potentially be returned to her family in that case.
And were the queens the only ones that were buried under the palaces? And even more interesting, perhaps, do we know if they were wearing that jewelry in real life, as we're assuming, because of patterns of wear that are on the jewelry in the burials?
Okay, so first, regarding the burials beneath the floor, the only palace where we have these queens buried is the Northwest Palace at Nimrud. There are multiple palaces at multiple capitals. However, it was only by accident in 1989 that the Iraqi team noticed the floor of one of the palace rooms was uneven, and they went to try to clean it up, and they discovered vaulting and that there was a whole room underneath that floor. And indeed it was a tomb, and there were shafts in the floor that went down with stairways into these tombs that had been there for 100 years, that nobody looked beneath the floor. So we very well might have other tombs in other palaces. Now, the queens and what seemed to be maybe some other royal women, such as former queens, mothers of king. There may be some other women also buried in the Northwest Palace. Where are the kings buried? The kings are buried beneath the floor of another palace. I'll get there to that in a moment. Why are the queens buried in the Northwest Palace? Because that's the palace they lived in. They are the women of the palace. That is their place. That is their identity. It doesn't mean they're kept in a harem hidden inside the palace, but they are the palace. And the palace is the palace because it is of the queen. So the queen's bodies have to be in the palace that rule was extended from, that they were living in. Now, the kings were buried at a palace in the city of Ashur, which was a ritual capital, which was a very ancient capital from pre-Neo-Assyrian times. So that was a ceremonial burial where they were put there in a kind of ritual context for another type of eternity, perhaps. All of those kings' tombs they may have been looted them, in ancient times. They're completely empty. I think there's a bead and a fragment of a bone or something that has been found. So they're almost completely empty. So we don't know what the king's burials looked like. The question of whether we know if they were wearing any of this jewelry in life, not just based on matching it up to the art, but based on wear marks, is one I cannot wait to be able to answer the day that I can examine this jewelry. Once the jewelry was excavated very quickly, as was necessary for security reasons, when you're finding gobs of gold quickly, it was immediately taken off site and it was stored in very secure locations. It remained in secure storage until 2003, when it was revealed. It was kept in a bank vault, just revealed to make sure everything is still there, it's intact, and then it was put back into, it's in an undisclosed location in a bank in Baghdad. It is not available for anybody to study, and in the times it has been out, it's been out in very briefly. The photographs that I've showed are the only photographs that exist. There's no wear marks that we can see in the photos, but that kind of thing needs to be examined and specifically looked for. I wouldn't be surprised if we would find it, but I can't say it's there when nobody has had a chance to look for it yet. But that's the reason, one of the many reasons. The other, there's many reasons, but another reason is some of the jewelry, I think it may have other inscriptions or carvings or symbols of scorpions, maybe carved into some of the beads that we can't see in the photos that exist. But I think we'll get more and more information once we can look at the jewelry.
So you're waiting with bated breath for that to happen.
I'm ready to
go. You hinted at the answer to this question in that a queen could be the head of her son's palace in some ways, but what change in status in general did a queen experience when her husband died?
In most, she remained a high-ranking officer, but her authority as queen would, if she did not continue in the role of queen to the next king, her title would be handed off to another woman, but she would, there's palaces that are referred to in text that we haven't found, like there's so much to discover, that belong to the mother of the king, that belong to high-ranking members of the royal family. So they seem to have lived under protection and with elite status, and probably continue to have ceremonial roles. The roles of the queens in ritual are very, very important. And it's not just the rituals they're enacting with the king, but enacting independently. Like we saw some of the images, it's just queen and goddess together. I think those ritual rules to some extent would continue after one is done serving as queen. You're still going to serve your gods and goddesses.
And there's a question about the necklace and other jewelry that looks like it has an evil eye in the middle of it. And what other protective imagery there was other than erotic imagery and scorpions and so on, that we might also think about as being of importance to queens, or maybe to every ordinary person?
So in addition, so we have the, what we're calling the evil eye kind of image. Anytime you have any divine figure or winged figure, that is also a protective kind of image. The radiance itself is a method of deflecting potential malevolence. There are all kinds of monsters and creatures that look really scary, but in some cases, you use these scary looking creatures to ward off even worse ones. So you can, fight a demon with a monster. So you can have some of that imagery. There is also, which don't survive, but we have ritual text describing the creation of figurines. It most closely reminds me of like a voodoo doll or something, that you would make a figurine of a problematic person and then break it apart to destroy it. But because those were all ritually broken, we don't have them. Some would be say to cast them into the river or something like that. But they were, what we might call superstitious. They had very real fears of malevolence, things they couldn't see, things they couldn't control, and also the motivations for their enemies to come against them. And even in their architecture, besides prayers and statements that were clear, they did things like there's dog figurines found in one of the palaces buried beneath the floor, and they have curses written on them, like to bite or attack somebody that would cross that threshold.
We're getting near the end here, so I'm going to do a couple more questions and then we'll bid everyone farewell. Do you have evidence of correspondence between some of these queens and other empires? For example, parallel to the Amarna letters?
So we do not have the international correspondence like the Amarna letters, which I would love to have, and it probably existed. It's just a matter of whether it's preserved. We do have one letter correspondence between two princesses of the court, and one is chastising the other, reminding her to kind of do her homework and work on her reading and writing. That woman becomes Labali Sharat, the queen, who had to do her homework. So we know that they're corresponding amongst each other, they're communicating, and it's very likely these queens had diplomatic roles coming from international courts. They would have maintained ties with those courts, and we see generation after generation of ties. So there certainly would have been correspondence, and there was literacy at this level.
And the last one I can fit in here is, do we know if the queens shared resources, or if even perhaps they shared jewelry?
So that is also queens, one after another. Did they pass things down? I suspect that there were certain elements of state regalia that were so sacred, both for kings on the king's end of things and for queens, that they were kept either in a certain part of the palace or more likely in a temple, and that those wouldn't change. The new queen would come in and use the same one that had been traditionally used. There are also possibilities of queens that have been buried with things that have inscriptions of other people on them. Were these gifts? Were these things that were passed down to them? We're not sure. The question of the headdresses, which I promised not to open up here at the last minute, but one possibility, those later queens are wearing a special kind of crown that looks like the walls of a city. And we don't see examples of that. There's some evidence for it earlier, but we don't see any example of that crown of city walls in the tombs, in the archaeological material evidence that we have. So the question is, you know, did it exist then? Why isn't it in the tomb? One of my theories is it was one of those state pieces of regalia, and that there was one mural crown that was passed down from queen to queen, not taken away in the burial. Why they're taking diverse crowns into the burial, maybe that is the headdresses that they wore from their maiden courts that they came from, or for certain ritual occasions, or that were personally made for them. But this state crown might have just been worn by every queen successively, and therefore we don't see it in a tomb.
That's a fabulous idea. What a great way to end. I'm sorry, everybody, that we have to leave you. I want to thank Amy enormously for joining us and telling us about queens and making our exhibition, which is quite male-centered, a little open to a female spirit. And I want to thank all of you for joining us and ask you to check getty.edu for further programs. And we hope we will be seeing you in the future with us online and in person at the Getty Villa Museum. Bye, everybody. Thank you, Amy.